all, and the respected head of the Department of Political Science, Associate Professor Dr. Shaza Shukri, and the respected esteemed colleagues of the Department of Political Science, and the respected participants who have joined with us tonight from all parts of the world, and our respected esteemed guest speaker, Associate Professor Dr. Fairaz. How to pronounce, Dr. your name? Fairaz Okli?
Feryaz or Jagler.
Okay, Fairaz.
Don't worry about it. It's complicated even in Turkish, so I understand.
Yeah, Fairaz, yeah. I warmly welcome you all to our webinar, an anticipated webinar on how Islamists mobilize voters, elite recruitment, organizational cohesiveness, and Islamist electoral success in Turkey. Organized by the Policy and Area Studies Research Unit of the Department of Political Science at International Islamic University of Malaysia. I am your moderator for today's session, and my name is Dr. Mohammed Fawz Mohammed Zeki, Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science at International Islamic University of Malaysia. This is a special webinar that try to expand our previous conversations on Islam and politics in the Muslim world, where we are today we are focusing on specifically on Islamism in Turkey. And I think our audience remember that our previous webinars actually covered Islamism in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Islamism in the Arab world in general. So we are going to continue that conversation today, hopefully. And today we are focusing on Turkey. As we all know, under the leadership of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey has witnessed a significant shift towards Islamist policies, shaping the nation's political and social landscape. Erdogan, who has been in power since 2003, the first as the Prime Minister and later as President, has spearheaded the Justice and Development Party, which is rooted in moderate Islamic principles. AKP's rise marked a departure from secular policies of the Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey. Over the past 2 decades, Erdogan has significantly transformed Turkey's social and political landscape. And importantly, under his leadership, the AK party has enjoyed substantial electoral success, maintaining a strong grip on power since 2003. So Recep Tayyip Erdogan's electoral success over the past 2 decades can be attributed to several key factors, according to the experts. One of them is his economic reforms, revitalized Turkey's economy, reducing inflation, boosting growth, which earned him a widespread support in 2000, early 2000 and later part of 2000. And also infrastructure project and improved healthcare and expanded education sector also contributed his popularity. So there is a global debate on what actually made Erdogan a successful politician and AK party a successful political party. And so in order to understand this phenomenon in a more deeper sense, we have invited an expert, and who is none other than Dr. Associate Professor Fairaz. And let me give a brief background about our speaker today. Dr. Fairaz is an Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Sigmore College in New York, the United States. He received his PhD in Political Science from Brown University. He teaches and conducts research on comparative politics, Islamist and ethnic politics, and food security. His recent publications examine the politics of state-business relations in late development and electoral strategies of Islamist parties, transition to authoritarianism in Turkey, and the relationship between oil and insurgency. Dr. Fairaz is currently conducting research in the Asian region with the support from Fulbright US Scholar Program. Thank you, Dr. Fairaz, for accepting our invitation to share your insights and thoughts on Islamism in Turkey. And so finally, let me share a few brief information about today's program. Firstly, we will listen to our speaker for roughly for 30 to 35 minutes. Then we will open up the floor for Q&A session and comment sessions. The participants and audience can ask the question directly, or they can write their questions in the chat box. And with that information, now it's time to listen to our guest speaker. Without further ado, I invite Dr. Fairuz to give his initial ideas. Thank you very much. The
Thank you
floor
so
is
much,
yours,
Professor Zaki. First of all, I'd like to thank Islamic International University of Malaysia, and specifically you, Dr. Zaki, for inviting me here. It's an honor to join you tonight in this webinar and to be able to share some of my research. And again, I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I am glad to hear that you have had this webinar series for a while, right? You've discussed a variety of the Islamic world, right? In which Islamist politics takes a variety of different shapes and different forms. I would say Turkey, I think, plays an important role in the global Islamic movements, but also a peculiar role, right? Turkey has this history of staunch secularism, which has shaped its political culture, political structures, political parties, right? Which plays a role, an interesting role in the advent of Islamist politics in Turkey, which might be a bit different, and I think in some ways it's a bit different from other parts of the world for sure. But also the AKP, the party about which we'll be talking tonight, right, has been an influential party, I think, among Islamist movements and parties in the world which have decided to run in elections, which have decided to contest power through elections. AKP, in short, I'll call the Adalet ve Kalkınma Partisi, or Justice and Development Party, with a Turkish acronym for it, AK Party, or in short, AKP. I think AKP has been an important exemplar in some ways. There have been Islamist parties that self-consciously model themselves on the structure and strategies of the AKP. So in that sense, I think it might be a good idea to think a little bit about the AKP when we're thinking about Islamist parties everywhere. Right. Again, thank you for inviting me here. I will note one thing, and maybe Professor Zaki, that is for you. I tend to speak a little quickly. If my voice cuts in any way, or if I'm going too quick, just please warn me. I tend to sort of get faster and faster as I talk, so yeah. I'll try to control it.
Doctor, you share any presentations?
I'm sorry?
Presentations? Any PowerPoint?
Yes, I will. I will just turn to it right now, and I'm about to share my screen, and we can go from there. Okay, right here. One moment, please, as it's been a while since I've done, and this reminds me of the pandemic times. Okay, can you see my presentation right now? Okay, hopefully everything is visible.
Yes, it's clear.
Right.
It's clear.
Fantastic. Again, but the title of my presentation tonight is How Islamists Mobilize Voters, Elite Recruitment, Organizational Cohesiveness, and Islamist Electoral Success in Turkey. Again, my name is Faryaz Ocaklı. I'm at Skidmore College in upstate New York, an associate professor there, but right now I'm located in Singapore at NTU, at the Department of Sociology, doing research on food politics in the region. But first of all, when we think about Islamist politics in Turkey, let me say a few words about what motivated this study in the first place. First of all, I think there has been many, but one of the important Orientalist assumptions about Islamist movements and parties around the world, and it was quite obvious to me as someone with a Muslim background and from a Muslim majority country studying for my PhD in the United States, that many of these assumptions about what Islamist parties are, what Islamist parties and movements are, how they work, how they operate, quite a few of these assumptions were based on a disturbing Orientalist underflow, Orientalist trend, which motivated the study for sure at the beginning. And I think one of these assumptions, you'll recognize it when I say it. There is this underlying assumption in the studies of Islamist movements that Islamists are somehow different from other political parties in their essence, as if other political parties, non-Islamist political parties and movements, they're engaged in quote-unquote normal politics. They talk about identities, they talk about welfare, they talk about economic growth, they talk about security policy, and they engage with their voters and voter blocs in a very sort of quotidian, normal fashion, whereas Islamist parties, they're all about culture, they're all about ideology, and their link to their voters is purely based on some kind of an understated or unstated ideological linkage between the political movement and the base, right? And the people who are in support of them. I think this is, I'm calling this in a sense an Orientalist assumption, because it posits that there is a fundamental distinction between political parties and movements that are of Islamist origin or Islamist substance versus any other kind of political movement, whether it's liberal, whether it's socialist, whether it's nationalist, right? As if there's this fundamental distinction. So part of my goal in sort of distributing the results of my research has been to push back against this assumption, right? I think my research, and as well as other people's research, of course, shows that Islamist parties and movements are political parties and political movements. And just like other political parties and political movements, they do politics, right? So in that sense, they do local politics, they do national politics, they do international politics. They engage with their support in authoritarian settings. When we look at Islamists in authoritarian settings, say across the Middle East, right? They engage with their supporters, even though those supporters are unfortunately unable to vote, right? But they engage with their supporters in fairly predictable ways, right? And in locations and places where Islamist parties are able to run in elections and choose to run in elections, they engage with their voters, and as again, not exactly in the same way that other parties do, but in their own way, they do engage their voters fairly heavily. So in that sense, I'd like to initially push back against this underlying assumption that there's something intrinsically different about Islamist political parties and other kinds of political parties. So bring Islamist parties into the mainstream, as it were, of a discussion, a conversation, or a study of political parties in general, right? Again, where Islamists draw their support from, right? They don't necessarily just draw their support from a public that automatically identifies or agrees with an Islamic political agenda, with some kind of Islamic sort of ideology. It's a complicated question. The relationship between voters and parties have always been complicated. It's not a very one-to-one, very predictable relationship, right? So therefore, where Islamist parties or movements get their support from, what kind of voters or supporters end up sort of supporting their movement, is an empirical question. And hopefully work like mine and others sort of bring us closer to understanding the ways in which Islamist parties and movements build their coalitions in the public. And second, another reason which motivated this study, as you will see in my presentation, my study is very much based on a subnational comparative analysis of politics inside of Turkey, right? So I do look at the Turkish case, as it were, right? My research is based on Turkey, and most research that is based on a sort of a country, if it was qualitative research based on a specific country, often treats that country as a case, and that used to be the case, at least when I was sort of doing this work some time ago. But the way I differentiated my work from that was to focus on a comparative framework, was to build a comparative framework which was inside sort of at the subnational level, but nevertheless very comparative at its heart, as you will see there, right? And part of the reason why I wanted to push ahead with this research design was that I think our knowledge of Turkey, but not just Turkey, of politics in the developing world, right, in the global South, is very much has geographical biases in it structurally, right? This in Turkey, for instance, the knowledge about Turkish politics, especially qualitative knowledge about Turkish politics, very much is based on an urban and geographical bias, and this is what I mean by it. First of all, national level theories and narratives, they ignore or flatten subnational complexity. So when you look at political histories of Islamist movements in Turkey, or case level explanations of something like the history and politics of Islamist parties or the AKP in Turkey, what you will see is a case study, right? It will focus on one national case, the Turkish case, and tell you a story or a narrative or a process tracing, right, within that framework. But the national level theories of that level that focus on the case as a country, right, again, they flatten, they ignore, and necessarily, right, they necessarily ignore the complexity that happens underneath. Sort of, if you just open that box, right, and look inside it, it ignores the complexity that is underneath that national level of analysis, which I think is a weakness, right? And I think that is something that we should overcome. But local politics is mostly missing. in these stories, we have this sort of a national obsession, which is important. I'm not saying it's not important, but local politics is also important. Most people's lives, sort of, in most people's lives, people are much more likely to interact with their local government than with the national government on a daily basis. But more, again, even more specifically for the case of Turkey, and perhaps there's something like this for Malaysia as well. So let me know if that's the case, right? For Turkey, most information, most knowledge you will have about Turkey is based on this research line, it's not even a triangle, it's a line, I would like to say, based on Istanbul, Ankara, and Diyarbakir, right? Istanbul is the historical, cultural, and economic center of Turkey, the former capital of the Ottoman Empire. So it's a very pleasant place. Researchers love to live there, so they mostly go there, right? And do their research there. Ankara is the capital. We all have, as political scientists, to be in and around the capital. People go there and do research there. Diyarbakir is the unofficial capital of the Kurdish minority in Turkey. So any work that focuses on ethnic minorities or the Kurds will take place mostly in Diyarbakir. And I should say, I have been to all these three places and done research there. I know these are simple, these are important places. But Turkey is not just Istanbul, Ankara, and Diyarbakir. It is much more than that, right? So therefore, what I try to do consciously in this work is to expand the domain of research outside of these cities and bring some more local complexity to it. And here's a little map of Turkey for you. If you're not very familiar with the sort of dimensions here, again, towards the west, we have Greece over here, right? In the north, this is the Black Sea, Ukraine is above, and Russia. In the south, we have, of course, Syria here and Egypt here. And in the east, we have Iran, again, Syria here, and Iraq to the right, and Georgia up in the north, right? So this is the Anatolian sort of Asia Minor, right? The Anatolian Peninsula. So again, Istanbul here. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse cursor, but I'm pointing at Istanbul right now. That's the cultural historical capital. Ankara is the current capital, and Diyarbakir is the center of Kurdish political activity. And again, I try to take this work. I mean, most research that you know on Turkey will come from these three places, and I try to expand beyond that. So other than these two reasons, why is it important, I think, to focus on Islamist parties and movements? I'm sure we're all familiar with this. I'm just going to go over this a bit quickly, but if there's any part of it that you'd like me to focus on, I can come back to it later. As we all know, especially since the 1970s all the way up until the 2010s, Islamist political parties were some of the most powerful forces in the Muslim world, but mostly in the opposition domain, right? So they were the dominant forms of oppositional movements. So in fact, again, the big question, especially that was being asked in Western capitals, is what happens if we see a wave of democratization in the Muslim world, the overwhelming sort of a public power, all Islamist movements and parties and the opposition, would that translate automatically to governing coalitions at the government, right? So we saw a little bit of an answer to that after 2011 and the rise of, for instance, the Arab Spring. Which unfortunately, I know, right, turned into a bit of an Arab winter, which didn't really work out for too much for the purposes of the demonstrators in the first place. But one result of the Arab Spring movement during this period was that more Islamists were able to join elections. More Islamists were able to join more openly to the political process. So again, we have seen many setbacks since the initial openings that followed 2010, 11, 12, that period in the Arab world. But one thing we have seen essentially that Islamists are involved way more in electoral politics than they were before, right? For instance, let's take the example of Tunisia and Ennahda, which used to be the most promising sort of part of the legacy of the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, I know that Tunisian democracy is not doing too well right now, for sure. But again, compared to say Egypt or Syria, right? Tunisia had a fairly peaceful transition of power from the Ben Ali regime, right? So again, state repression under the authoritarian regime in Tunisia. Again, it was the only Arab Spring regime that upheld the democratic system. And Ennahda, right, the Renaissance Party, became a significant actor since the ouster of the authoritarian leader Ben Ali. And the leader of Ennahda party, Rashid Al-Ghanouchi, openly said that Ennahda will follow the AKP model, the model that was developed in Turkey. So in that sense, I think the Turkish case is an important example to some of these parties abroad. I mean, again, we have to raise the example of Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, a very short-lived experience in democracy, of course, from 2011 to 2013. But the Muslim Brotherhood did emerge as the most powerful political movement right after the ouster of the Mubarak regime there, was able to win the presidential elections, was able to win the parliamentary elections, although it had to compete with a sort of a different Islamist movement like the Al-Noor party during those elections, right? But what this experience showed us, other than the fact that in Egypt, apparently the military will never allow this kind of an experiment again, it seems like. But other than that, what this sort of experiment also showed us is that national office, winning national office and holding national office and in an electoral regime, in an electoral system, requires broadening a party's support base, right? No political party can really sit content with a fairly narrow coalition and hope to govern, right, in any kind of in any longevity, unless they want to, they are able to appeal to voters and people, right, who do not necessarily want to see eye to eye with the political party itself, right, who do not necessarily agree with the entire political platform of the party. We know that all political parties draw support from voters who may be very ideologically aligned with the party, but also others, right, who may not be that ideologically aligned with the party, but who vote for pragmatic reasons, political variety of economic reasons, social, cultural reasons, and all political parties want to expand their coalition of that into that domain, right, into this voting bloc that exists a little beyond its core supporters, right, and that's the necessity, and that's, I think, is where AKP can teach us something. So the research questions here that I'm investigating are, what are the causes of Islamist electoral success? That's the big general question. How do Islamist parties expand their support base and form broad coalitions? That broadening of the coalition is the primary focus of my work, right? What are the mechanisms through which Islamists expand their electoral appeal beyond their core constituency into what we might call the swing voters or the non-core constituency? So again, I think the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, the AK Party in Turkey, right, is a fantastic case with which to study these important questions. First of all, I mean, and this work here, what I'm presenting, is mostly focused on the formation of the AKP and its initial electoral successes, which built the momentum which built the momentum that kept it in power later, right? So I'm mostly interested in this presentation and in this work in the period between 2000 and 2001, right before the formation of the AKP, all the way up and including 2004, 2007, 2009 elections. And after 2010, the AKP has become what we know of it today, a behemoth of political power in Turkey that has been holding on to office for over 22 years. And the story kind of changes. I think the story of the AKP changes in mid-2010s as it becomes a dominant force within the state, right? And I have an entire different slides for that part, and I'm not going to focus on that part of my work. But if you're interested in it in the Q&A, I'd be very happy to talk about how the AKP has changed as it held on to power, as it stayed in the government for over 10 years. But let's have a look at this initial period when the AKP built that coalition in the first place, which I think is a very crucial part of its history. So first of all, during this period, 2002, 2004, 7, 9, the AKP is democratically elected. Absolutely, right? It is an ideologically moderate party, and that's a very loaded term, I realize. Right? And I'd be happy to open that up more. But let's just say, for the purposes of this presentation right now, that compared to its immediate predecessors, compared to the Islamist parties from which the AKP emerged, right, the founders of the party organization explicitly and openly moderated their ideologies. They explicitly said, we no longer follow exactly in the footsteps of our previous political party in which we were active as leaders, right? We are not now much more moderate. We are now much closer to the political center of Turkish society, right? Erdogan famously said, we took the national outlook, we took the shirt of national outlook from our backs. The national outlook was the name of the ideology of the previous Islamist party, the welfare party, right? So there was an explicit attempt by the leaders of this party to quote unquote moderate their ideology. So it's ideologically moderate in that sense. And also, for our purposes, what's also crucial here is that the AKP's constituency targeting strategy sort of diverged from its predecessors, which used to focus much more on their core constituencies, and AKP focused on the non-core constituencies. The people who do not immediately agree or identify with the Islamist vision that was held by the political leaders, but those in the slight periphery of this group, right? I'm here thinking about voters who used to vote for more secularist center-right political parties, right? The AKP was able to locate itself towards the center of the political spectrum and gather votes from this vote-rich group. So that's for that purpose also AKP is really important for us. Right. So again, we have a political party that emerges from predecessors, other Islamist parties in the past, which used to have a narrower ideological focus and a narrower constituency targeting strategy. The AKP comes into the picture in 2001 and explicitly says, we're no longer following this model. We're much more ideologically open now, and we're targeting a constituency that is in the middle, mostly center-right, of the Turkish political spectrum. So just to illustrate the point here a little bit, in 1999, the AKP wasn't alive yet, right? This is before it was born. But the AKP's immediate predecessor, in this case, the FP, this is the immediate, the one after the Refah part. We have, I'm sorry, Turkey bans political parties left and right, so their name changes occasionally, right? So this is the party that was formed right after the Refah party. So this is a short political party, right? The FP ran in the 1999 local elections, and as you can see, it was quite successful in local elections, right? So this is Istanbul right here. It was the local elections were won by the Islamist party in Istanbul at that time, 1994, again in 1999. Ankara went over to FP during this period. Konya, which is the conservative heartland, which is again with the Islamist party here. And as you can see, there are a number of parts across the Turkish provincial landscape that the Islamist party has done quite well. But the secularist parties, ethnic political parties over here, center-right parties, they're still doing well. It's a complicated picture. But let's have a look at what happened a mere 5 years later. This is the map from 2004. Right? The green here is the AKP. I mean, let's just compare it again one more time, right? This is the AKP's predecessors. Look at the complexity of this map and look how the map has become simplified a mere 5 years later. This is merely about 3 years after the foundation, no, 2 years after the foundation of the AKP, right? So AKP managed to broaden its support base, in an explosive manner, and able to bring eliminate its rivals in the center and center-right of the political spectrum and occupy a very dominant place in Turkish political discourse. And this dominance has been continuing since then. You might know that in the last couple of months ago, we had another election in Turkey, local elections. And this picture started changing a little bit. The CHP, the Republican People's Party, which is the secularist party in Turkey, has made some really significant gains. But again, overall, AKP's dominance and power continues. So what are some of the existing explanations of Islamist electoral success that were very dominant in the literature, right, of our in political science and sociology literatures, right, of our understanding of Islamist parties and movements? Again, if you've been talking about Islamist movements in Pakistan, in other parts of the world, in the Arab world, you'll be very familiar with some of these arguments, right? I'll just mention them briefly. And again, if you have more questions later, we can dig into those a bit more. But part of the explanations about why Islamist parties do so well, at least they seem to be popular in the Muslim world, part of the explanation goes back to this anti-West backlash idea, right? So this notion essentially that is the Islamic world, the Islamic civilization used to occupy a dominant place in world history. We all have a memory of those golden ages, right? But since the advent of modernization, colonization, and capitalism, the Muslim world has fallen behind the West, and Muslims are across the world have this urge to strike back against this reversal of fortune, and this animus leads them to support Islamist parties and movements. Interestingly enough, both Bernard Lewis, Huntington make this argument, but some others as well make this argument. We hear some of this argument in the speeches and political actions of some of the Islamist leaders themselves, actually, that essentially sort of harken back to an era where the West was much less dominant vis-a-vis the Muslim world. Well, of course, the problem with this, and I'll just mention it very briefly and move on, but the problem with this is this flattens all of the complexity and diversity in the Muslim world, right? Sort of voters or citizens from places as diverse as I'm not sure, Morocco to Malaysia are not uniformly sitting around and thinking about the declining fortunes of the Muslim world while they're voting in their local elections. So this is a very general, very from top-down theory that misses, I think, that obscures more than it explains. There's another argument there, which is much more nuanced. I'm actually very much fond of this argument, although I think it has its weaknesses. Others have claimed that this has something to do with the cultural repertoires, right, of Islamist politicians. They basically argued, I mean, these are some of the anthropological studies as well, right, which make a very interesting point that when interacting with supporters, or in some contexts, voters, Islamist parties enjoy a rhetorical advantage, perhaps over their more secular counterparts, because they're able to use Islamic idioms and traditions to illustrate political points that others miss, right? So the ease with which the Islamic symbols are appropriated, right, for political projects by these Islamist movements give them a rhetorical advantage over their secular counterparts. I think there's an element of truth to this story, right? But again, this story also doesn't explain why. Maybe this story tells us gives us a bit of an explanation of why Islamist parties and movements do well, but it doesn't tell us much about why they don't do well in certain parts of the country, certain parts of the world, right? If we have to have a good theory of political success, we have to have a adjacent theory of political failure as well, right? What explains Islamist political success and failure? What explains the variation? Economic failures of the nation states, again, briefly, this theory argues that Islamists have grown in influence because secular states promised so much during the 20th century, but they delivered so little, right? So in that sense, a vote for the Islamists is a backlash against the more dominant secularist forces in society that have been in power predominantly since decolonization, since that era. Concomitant together with this theory, an adjacent theory, I would say, states that, well, perhaps the left would carry all these votes of discontentment, right? If we're focusing on, for instance, the Islamist votes that are coming from the periphery of the urban spaces, right, the working class, from the informal sector, right? Perhaps the social democratic or the socialist left would have been well positioned to carry these voters, but in a context where the left is very weak in the global south, essentially, especially following the collapse of the Soviet Union, this potential voting bloc was left open by the left and was essentially taken over by Islamist movements. An interesting theory for sure. And last but not least, there's a series of arguments about newly rich Muslim capitalists, right? So if the weakness of the left argument sort of explains the Islamist electoral success with reference to what the left could have done vis-a-vis the working class, right? This other theory basically explains what the Islamists were able to do working with the capitalist class, right? So here the focus is not necessarily on big capital. Big capital is usually nurtured by the state and sort of existing state structures. Here the focus is much more on newly fledgling sort of a small to medium-sized capital, especially coming from more sort of religious backgrounds, right, which became driving forces behind some of these Islamist parties. And in Turkey, that was definitely the case, right? Again, though, all of these theories, I think, teach us something about the growth of Islamist movements and parties, but they fail to explain the subnational and sometimes transnational complexities and variations in the support for these movements. Right? So this is where I position my own work. So what I try to do within this context, the addition that I try to bring here is to say there's an interesting story at the local level that we're not telling, right? These Islamist political parties and movements, they have politicians in them, right? They operate at the local level. These politicians interact with voters in some very interesting ways, right? What all of this is missing is actually the politics of Islamist politics, right? How they interact with their voter base, how they change, how they try to persuade people to vote for their political party or movement. So to be able to understand that, I think we have to go to the subnational level. We have to go to the local level. And here's my research design for all of us comparative politics enthusiasts. Just a few words here. This is the way I design my research. The main cases I have here are Çorlu and Gebze, Ödemiş and Salihli. Kınık is a small case. Bingöl and Muş, Malazgirt is a small case here, right? Just to walk you through this map a little bit, I think this research design is doing a lot of the heavy lifting in my work, so I'll say a few words about how I designed this, right? So if you look at here, the AKP, the Islamist party here, right, won elections in the town of Gebze, town of Ödemiş, and town of Bingöl, right? But in very similar towns, very similar cities, it lost elections. So I'm trying to bring in the negative cases here. In Çorlu, for instance, here, the secularists, CHP, won the elections consistently. Right? So if you look at Çorlu and Gebze, both are industrial towns in the northwest of the country surrounding Istanbul. They're economically vibrant, Western and large places with ethnic diversity. But in one of them, in Çorlu, the secularists win the elections. In the other one, the AKP wins the elections, right? So if any of the previous theories that I mentioned would, especially economic and economic ones, right, could explain Islamist electoral success, we should have seen both AKP doing pretty much equally well in Çorlu and Gebze, because they're such similar towns. If I place you in Çorlu or in Gebze, you wouldn't be able to tell which town you are in. They're so similar to each other, right, in many ways. So the AKP doing extremely well in Gebze, but not so well at all in Çorlu, tells us there's something missing in our understanding, right? They're doing something differently in these two places. So a similar story happens between Ödemiş and Salihli here in the middle row. They're both agricultural towns, economically vibrant in the West. These are small agricultural towns, ethnically homogeneous places. Again, in Salihli case, the secularist party wins elections consistently. In Ödemiş case, the Islamist party wins elections. In the bottom one, then we have Bingöl and Muş. These are both Kurdish, very small, economically depressed, and eastern provinces. Bingöl was the third poorest province while I was doing my research there in Turkey, out of about 80. And Muş was the poorest one, right? So again, very similar places. They're located right next to each other. You can travel from one to the other in about an hour and a half. In Bingöl, AKP won about 76% of the vote share, which in 2007, which was the highest share that AKP ever got. In Muş, the pro-Kurdish socialist-leaning DTP and its successor parties have been very successful. So again, something is missing at the local level. So what I'm trying to do in my work is to explain why the AKP wins in places like Gebze, Ödemiş, and Bingöl, but it loses votes and elections in places like very similar places like Çorlu, Salihli, and Muş. So again, this is a brief map of where I've done my research. I mean, I include Istanbul, Ankara, and Diyarbakır because you have to be in those places if you're doing research in Turkey occasionally. But other parts are, this is, for instance, is Bingöl, this is Muş on the eastern side of the country. This is Çorlu right here in the European side of the country, and Gebze right here. These are both bordering towns to Istanbul. When Istanbul go through this industry, they went there. And again, this is Kınık, Salihli, and Ödemiş, very close to each other. These are some of the agricultural heartlands of the country. So my research took place in these places. Just a couple of photos. I've done field work. I have to share my photos with you a little bit. These photos are from Diyarbakır. For instance, again, I was doing a series of interviews with civil society organizations. This is a photo that I did not take, but I'm showing it because I think it's such a spectacular photo of an AKP political rally in Istanbul. Again, Turkish political elections are very flamboyant events, I would say. This is right before a local election in Kınık. Everyone puts up their party flags. It's not very environmentally sustainable, I must say. This is all plastic. But a few days after the election, everyone removes them. But it's an exciting time to be in an election in Turkey. I would recommend that you visit Turkey during election times. It's exciting. Again, streets of a small agricultural town in the West, right before an election. Every political party in Turkey has to visit coffee houses every night, right about a couple months before the election. Coffee house visits is a very traditional part of Turkish political culture. Here's a secularist candidate visiting the local coffee house and talking to potential voters. Here's another local political rally in a cafe. So again, this is a time when it was very active while I was doing my research. They're very active. So what's my argument? I know I'm taking some time here, right? So do I have any time left? So what is my argument here? The AKP is electorally successful when it strategically incorporates local notables and the sport party organizations are cohesive. Just a very few quick words here. I believe that what enabled AKP to be successful was the way it was able to reach out to local constituencies, local voters, able to bring them into its party organization at a crucial time of transition in Turkey. Right? It was able to bring in local political, you could call them elites, but notables, people who are centrally located in local social networks, but who are not previously associated with Islamist movements. Right? I'm thinking here politicians from center-right parties. Depending on the place, I'm thinking here about clan leaders in the Kurdish East, especially clan or tribal elites. I'm thinking here about some prominent civil society net leaders. I'm thinking here about merchants and businessmen, right? So these are the people who were not previously associated with Islamists, but neither were they associated with very left-wing movements, though they're out of bounds. You can't actually reach them. They're too far from each other. But these notables who are in the political center to the center right of the political spectrum, the AKP invited all of them. to their party organization. So in parts of the country, they were able to bring, again, strategically with choice, a number of these individuals into the party organization. That was a necessary factor to be able to make the credible claim that the AKP is not like its predecessors. It's a party for the many, not for the few, right? So it signaled transformation in essence. But the question is, when you bring all these disparate different people together, can you hold them together, right? Or are they going to stab each other in the back for political purposes, right? And there are some cases, some stories that I can tell you about that happening. So in places where they were able to do both, they were very successful. In places where one or the other dimension of this, or both of these dimensions failed, they didn't do too well. That's the heart of my story here. So a very simple illustration of my argument: strategic elite incorporation coupled with organizational cohesiveness at the local, provincial level gives us an Islamist electoral success. Again, what is Islamic about this? Not much. This is an organizational explanation, right? So in a sense, this is an explanation of party that in this case applies to the AKP. So here's a bit more of a complicated picture, but don't worry too much about I can explain it all of it as I go through the cases in a bit here. But what I'm arguing in my work is that strategic incorporation, strategic elite incorporation, gives us a credible signal of moderation. We're basically saying we're not the old party, we're the new party. Look at who's running our party organizations, right? So which cultivates an inclusive image at the local level, right? If it works, it cultivates an Islamist image. And also, when you bring these local elites, they can engage in brokerage activities in the sense that they can take you inside the heart of these voter networks. Right? They can get you inroads in there. If you couple this brokerage with community outreach programs, right, you get effective local community permeation. And the AKP has been a master of reaching the society in its capillaries. It's in the neighborhood and street level. But you can only really build effective community outreach efforts if you not only you can only do that if you also have a cohesive party organization. If all of your politicians are stabbing each other in the back, you will not get a local party. So here there's a combination. Brokerage and community outreach go together for effective local party activities, but also party cohesiveness gives us party discipline, avoid factionalism. All of this combined gives us electoral success. Again, I arrived at this explanation very much through experience, very much through in-depth field work. I spent an entire year visiting and living in these towns where I observed these things firsthand. So just a few words on some of these mechanisms. The party recruits local elites selectively across different sectors of social influence within its non-core constituency. So, right, so center-right politicians, merchants, businessmen, tribal elites. The party should have, ideally, no major divisions in the local party organization, and the party should behave as a united actor in the local community. Easier said than done, right? So when there are, for instance, in one case, in Çorlu, there were about 16 people who wanted to be the mayoral candidate in the 2009 election. And when one of those were chosen and the other 15 were not, they each tried to undermine the selected candidates, and the local effort to choose the mayor from the AKP failed utterly, for instance. Right? So again, both of these combined together gives us, I think, an effective party organization which sort of dives into which gets into the capillaries of the local politics, which reaches into this previously unavailable voter bloc in the center right, in the center of the political spectrum. You get inroads to that spectrum with the local elites you attract, and then building on those inroads, you build local community outreach efforts, which AKP did through a variety of neighborhood meetings, street meetings, very regular schedules kept in outreach towards this potential constituency. And when you combine all of these together, do you have a chance actually of moving out of your previous niche and breaking into the mainstream the way that AKP did. So just to walk you again through some of my cases and how my explanation matches with with the cases I described to you before. So what happened in the Turkish case in the early 2000s was that at the national level, the party leaders that formed the AKP declared their moderation, declared their intention to move towards the political center. But the other wing of the Islamist movement from which these people came, the other part of it didn't, right? They went ahead and formed another Islamist party called the Saadet Partisi, which is still to this day a very small, very kind of fringe Islamist party in Turkey. They did not moderate, they kept to themselves essentially, and they didn't grow, right? But the AKP signaled this moderation, and then went into politics in that way, right? And then I'm moving to the local level. In parts of the country, the AKP was able to build a broad coalition at the local level. But in some other parts, it didn't, right? So for instance, in my cases in Salihli and Mush, they weren't able to expand this opposition, this coalition, for a variety of reasons I can discuss, right? And there they failed. But in other parts other parts of the country where they were able to broaden this coalition, we have to ask the question: was the party cohesive, right? In some parts, not so much, right? I gave the example of Chorlu, where the coalition was broad, but the party was eating itself from the inside. They lost elections. But in other parts, right, in Gebze, Ödemiş, and Bingöl, they were able to work together effectively, and they were able to bring some massive electoral victories. Right. So that's the overall story I'm telling here, and I'm going to stop right here so we have time to discuss maybe.
Thank you, Dr. Fairuz, for a wonderful and exciting presentation. Now the floor is open for any questions and comments, and our audience can either ask the question directly, unmute themselves and ask, or they can write the question in the chat box. To start with, I would like to ask a question using the privilege of a moderator of the session. And generally, it is said that AKP has changed its ideology from a liberal, a more moderate Islamism, and that incorporated some liberal premises towards more nationalist Islamist fabric.
Yes.
After 2015 and 16. How this ideological shift actually correspond to your ground level, this sort of connecting the party to the ground level dynamics. How you
Absolutely.
connect both this ideological shift and this your local politics? How both correspond each other?
Dr. Zaki, this is such a fantastic question, honestly. Even when you were asking it, I'm just like 7 things are going through in my mind, right? Because when we phrase these questions, sometimes it seems as if, I mean, when I only knew, I mean, in general, when we talk about ideological change in this Islamist political party or movement, it sort of seems as if people are changing their minds. It's an ideational change, which has some policy implications down the line, right? Sometimes these issues are discussed in that simplistic manner, and it can't be further from the truth, right? The ideological changes and sort of very much mirror and go hand in hand with the political realities of the political coalitions that are holding this group together, and in this case in the Turkish political landscape, right? I'm sure so I'll give you one example here. I'm sure we're all familiar with, maybe vaguely familiar with, but familiar with, right? The coup attempt that took place in Turkey about a bit less than 10 years ago now, right? So there was an actual coup attempt in Turkey, and the Turkish government very squarely blamed it on whom? On the Gülen movement, right? So another Islamic movement with which the AKP itself has been very much in close collaboration before the coup attempt, right? So first of all, this goes us to get to my initial point here, right? That Islamist movements are not essentially that different from other political movements and parties. There's a lot of infighting sometimes, right? So these are 2 distinct Islamist movements in Turkey: the Gülen movement, and the Erdogan sort of represents the AKP and the welfare party, that line of Islamist movements. They were very, so when I was doing my field research in the local politics of Turkey, right, this was before the bulk of my field work was before this breaking up, before this divorce between the Gülen movement and the AKP. And at the local level, it was so clear, right, that at least I would say about 1/3 or more of every single AKP local organization in any of these towns I visited were made up of Gülen supporters, right? The Gülen supporters and the AKP supporters were together. Absolutely, right? Collaborating in all ways, right? Again, the Gülen supporters tended to be more active in business politics and sort of local business associations and in education. And the AKP were more overtly political, right? But again, there was a collaboration for sure. But what happened after the coup attempt, for instance, right, and this falling off? I visited my sites again, and I talked to sort of the local politicians that I knew from my past research, and I asked about sort of this falling out at the national level. And in the local level, yeah, there was a mirroring effect of falling out, right? So you either some of these Gulen supporters were pushed outside the party if they were not criminalized. Many of them ended up in prison. But the ones who were so low level in the organization that they didn't go to prison, right, they were just pushed out of the party. But a significant chunk just renounced their affiliations to the previous associations with the Gulen party and continued, made their choice towards the AKP side and remained within the party, though everyone pretty much suspects essentially this might be half true, half self-serving, right? So that's part of the story. And a concomitant part, together part of it is the AKP's initial sort of a problem in Turkish politics was with the staunchly secularist military, bureaucracy, and judiciary, right? But it took AKP about 10 years to get rid of that, right? So together with the Gülen movement, they have basically frictioned away the power of those entrenched bureaucratic elites, right? And after 2011 or 12 or so, especially after those famous court cases that sort of alleged sort of coup attempts by the Kemalist military forces, right, and the imprisoning of some of the top generals in Turkey, right, the AKP has eliminated that threat. So after that period, the AKP did not necessarily need to appeal to the liberal sensibilities of some of the secularist Turks either, right? So instead of that, I'm complicating it, I'm sorry, there's so much to talk about, but and on top of that, an attempt by the AKP to resolve the Kurdish conflict through negotiations with the illegal wing of the Kurdish movement, the PKK, has also failed during that period. And the AKP changed course, made a complete transition, and built a new coalition and a partnership with the ultra-nationalist political party in Turkey, the MHP. These are extreme right-wing Turkish nationalists, right? When the AKP turned towards this new ally, it basically left behind all of its liberal, potentially reconciliatory measures. And now, for the last 8 years or so, the AKP and the AKP-MHP coalition basically represents the center-right, the Islamic right, and definitely the ultra-nationalist right. It's a coalescence of the right-wing forces, essentially.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any other questions?
I have a question, sir.
Mahrin, you go with your question.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, doctor. Thank you for taking the time to give us your insights. Your research sounds incredibly interesting. So my question is, as I understand, one of the key principles of democracy is that power is transitional, right? The parties come and go. Opposing forces are just as important as ruling forces, etc. So according to what I've read, I might be wrong about this, but according to what I've read, it seems that recently the AKP's values have switched a little from promoting democracy to running unrivaled. So there's an argument that it's kind of populist now. Do you think this is a threat to Turkey's democracy, to the foundation of democracy, or is your democratic foundation strong enough to move past that? Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is such a fantastic question
Dr.
as well.
Fairaz, I'd like to add a small piece that since you focus on local aspect, since this electoral strategy, that actually pushed for that populist narratives, if I may say, like the Mahrin asked, just to add some part to the Mahrin's question. You can answer.
Absolutely. Thank you again. Thank you for these fantastic questions. And I also see there's a question in the chat as well. About some excessively repressive secularist legacy coming from. I think we can combine some of these actually together, and I'll try to respond to these in part. So certainly the repressive aspects of the Kemalist regime that came before the AKP's initial electoral success has been a part of it, right? There has always been an opposition to the repressive policies of the secularist regime in Turkey since Turkey's turn to electoral democracy, electoral politics, let's say, right, in the 1950s. And the initial oppositional force in Turkish politics against Mustafa Kemal's party, CHP, was the Democratic Party. And even though it was classified as center-right, it was very much formed in opposition to some of these excessive practices, for sure. So yes, there has been a historical voting bloc in Turkey. And again, I should mention, Turkish politics is party politics, right? Party politics tracks very well in what happens in Turkey. So there has been this historical voting bloc in Turkey, which has very much been been in opposition to some of these secularist power bloc, right? And its vote has sort of gone up and down. So this has certainly given an impetus for supporters to join the AKP in the first place. But I should say, for a very long time, from the 1950s all the way to 2000, most of that vote, which were motivated by, again, the repressive practices that we see, they didn't necessarily go for the Islamist parties, right? There were other center-right political parties which were milder in their critique of the central state establishment, right? Which nevertheless sort of captured the vote of these groups. So it is still an open question. Why did these voters who used to support center-right political parties switch their votes over to the AKP in 2000? And hopefully my work contributes a little bit to our understanding of that question, right? And to get back to the speaker's question here, absolutely, the AKP in early 2000s very much benefited from a very pro-democratic and liberal rhetorical landscape, in a sense, right? They certainly, for instance, the AKP initially argued for accession to the European Union, essentially framed its struggle in Turkey away from a struggle. So again, the rhetorical twist was this, right? Its predecessor parties used to speak about religious freedom in Turkey, which is important in its own right, of course. But AKP rephrased this as saying this is not just about religious freedom. This is about human freedom in general, right? Rights. For instance, right, when I was in university in early 2000s in Turkey, there was a law that had been passed by the secularist establishment that prohibited from some of our friends who wore the hijab from attending classes, right? This was, again, a very repressive practice by the secularist establishment. And AKP reframed this as a right to wear the hijab or the religious freedom to saying this is a liberal right to dress as you will, right? So this is basically a human right. So AKP made that rhetorical switch very effectively and benefited from that. But as time passed and the AKP consolidated this power in the government, I would argue very much so that it has become a party that is much more identified with the state. So the AKP basically came to change some of those intrinsically powerful groups in the government, in the state apparatus. But now AKP is pretty much the state, right? So it didn't necessarily transform the state and reduce its power to a place where it's sort of open to democratic participation and contestation. The AKP essentially has joined forces with some of these repressive apparatuses within the state organization and has made opposition to its rule very difficult in Turkey. In fact, I have another article that I have recently written, and I have another presentation somewhere ready to go, about this transition, which I call an authoritarian transition in Turkey. Many of my colleagues call this competitive authoritarianism, and perhaps with good reason, because elections still happen. And as we saw in the latest round of local elections, opposition parties can still win elections at the local level for sure, right? It's still a democracy in that sense. But on the other hand, the electoral landscape is so skewed. And I can't emphasize how skewed it is. It's so skewed in favor of the AKP that it's hard to call it a liberal democracy at all, right? So for instance, just let's give an example. In the latest presidential election that happened last year, I don't want to get the numbers wrong, but I'm very much in the vicinity of the correct numbers here. The President Erdogan appeared on the state television, TRT state television, in a sort of in the realm of hours of speeches, hours of public outreach, and all of that televised, right? The opposition candidate Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was there for a grand total of 38 seconds in the entire political sort of the campaign period, right? So it is very common to see that in the AKP-dominated media landscape of Turkey, and about 80% or so of the TV channels and newspapers are owned by corporations that are very close with the government, right? So in this information landscape, it's very difficult for the opposition forces to break through into it. But of course, social media has changed the landscape quite a bit and all that. But I will say that, yes, absolutely. The AKP has skewed the electoral landscape to a place where it's very hard to call it a free and fair competition.
Thank you, Prof. There is a final question. So we have to wrap up. It's 9 o'clock. So Dr. Muir, he's my colleague. He's asking, would love to hear more of your comments, Prof, on to what extent Turkish nationalism currently influenced by nationalism on the European counterpart.
Fantastic question. Again, thank you so much. And nationalism, I believe, is still the most powerful force in Turkish politics. It's very difficult to find a successful political party that is anti-nationalist or not nationalist. It's just impossible, basically. The only exception to that, of course, is the party that represents the Kurdish national movement, right? So currently it's the DEM party, the Democratic Party, the Democratic Movement Party, that represents, again, as I said, the Kurdish national aspirations, and it also positions itself as a socialist party, and it's an important party in Turkey for sure, right? It's consistently represented in the legislature, and also draws support not just from Kurds. Again, Kurdish votes are split as well. Some votes go to the Islamist movement, and some goes to the socialist, but also nationalist sort of a movement. But this party also draws support from socialist and left-wing Turks too. But other than that important exception, right, I would say the rest of the political spectrum is nationalist in one way or another, right? So at one end, of course, we have the MHP that I mentioned is in a coalition with the AKP right now, together with Erdogan. They are the ultra-nationalists, right? But this movement has sprouted multiple political parties. So İYİ Party is an offshoot of the MHP, which was in the opposition in the last election, for instance. That's also a very nationalist party. The CHP, the Republican People's Party, the party that Atatürk himself has founded, is very much secular nationalist. It's not non-nationalist, right? It's very much secular nationalist. How does this sort of correspond to European nationalism? I mean, the origins of Turkish nationalism, right, itself, historically, is very much a response to the growing nationalist movements that split the empire apart, right? In the Ottoman Empire, your Serbian nationalism, Greek nationalism, Bulgarian nationalism, Romanian nationalism, all of these nationalisms is what basically destroyed the empire to begin with, right? And Turkish nationalism came in a sense as a response to the growing nationalisms of the ethnic minorities in the Ottoman Empire historically, right? Which were very much themselves influenced by French and other forms of nationalisms, right? And today, I mean, but it's become, even though in that sense it came from Europe, right? But it's so domesticated in a sense, right? It's such a domestic political force right now. It's hard to find, again, except for that one important exception, right? The Kurdish party. Other than that, the entire spectrum is nationalist, of different hues and different varieties, but all of it are.
Thank you, Dr. Fairaz. I think now we have to wrap up because it's already 5:09. And so thank you for Dr. Fairaz for your insights and accepting our invitation. And so before I wrap up, I officially want to express my gratitude on behalf of the department and my colleagues, and to the guest speaker, Dr. Fairaz, who shared with us some incredible thoughts and ideas that we hope to benefit from his knowledge and future research, hopefully. And and also to a big thank you to all our incredible audience and my students, and for their engagement and questions. Before I end this session, I would like to remind that we have another webinar coming up on 29th of May, coming Friday, not this Friday, the coming Friday, on classical Islamic political theology and its impact on political modern Islamic political thought. And the speaker of the event will be Professor Muhammad Fazil, Professor of Islamic Law at the University of Toronto. And so I invite you all to join in that event as well, share your critical observations. And with that note, I would like to conclude our webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Fairaz, and I hope to see you in person
Inshallah.
in Malaysia, inshallah, and to share with us your ongoing research. And I'm quite interested on your current research project as well. It's about food security or food politics. Food politics, yeah. I think we should have a session on that. And it's quite interesting, and I think my students also will be very interested.
Absolutely. Anytime, Dr. Zakis. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. And so with that note, I conclude this webinar with the recitation of Surah Al-Asr. Bismillah. Thank you, everyone.